section of the portfolio risk and return topics and issues that we introduced and began a discussion of in part 1. Specifically, we're going to get into a little bit more details and a little bit more of the math and a little bit more of the algebra and a little bit more, if you want to think of it, of the graphing and the geometry. Some people kind of think of it as, no, John, it's not geometry, but there's going to be a lot of lines and be some graphing and get into a little bit more details about the connections between expected return and what are the drivers of expected return. And that's pretty much the biggest gist of this portion of the material here in the second portion of this portfolio risk and return segment of the video series. So let's just kind of review just a tad. Hey, just a little bit of a tad, and this is these are connected, or at least this slide is a nice transition because it is connected to a topic that we discussed and introduced in part 1. In that, when we combine, when we formulate that there is a risky portfolio out there. Now, remember we talked about the issue associated with expected return and standard deviation. And again, let me make sure I got the right tools here. Sometimes technology is great, and then whenever you select on it, it doesn't turn out as good as you thought it was going to be. Oh well. So the idea is that we had what? We had risky portfolio, and we're not stating what this risky portfolio is just yet. It could be a it could be one asset, it could be a combination of 3 assets, it could be a combination of 500 assets. And remember, the expected return and standard deviations are going to be determined, and just going to be determined by the formulas that we discussed, and specifically the expected return. Okay, the expected return of any portfolio, just to kind of remind you, okay, of any portfolio is nothing other than the weight of asset A times the expected return of asset A, okay, plus the weight of asset B times the expected return of asset B, plus the weights of all the assets in the portfolio times its expected return. Well, in this case, all right, now we were introducing the standpoint. Okay, and also to the standard deviation of that portfolio is what? The weight squared times standard deviation squared, or the variance squared, plus the weight squared times standard deviation of the asset squared, plus 2 times the weights and the covariance and the correlations, right? So I mean, it gets to be if you have more than 2 assets, it gets to be a combination of a bunch of inputs. You get more than 500 assets. I mean, that formula gets really onerous, right? So what we want to do here now is just to kind of remind you that what we're doing specifically in this case here, what we're trying to do is ultimately get to a little bit more tractability in trying to determine which portfolio, the expected return of the portfolio, its variance, and which portfolios we should choose. So we are going to introduce the concept, all right, we're going to introduce the concept in which we'd already done here of combining a risky portfolio with the risk-free asset. And remember now, its expected return is determined by that generalized formula of the weight times its expected return of the assets summed across all different assets. So that's the same, okay, that's the same. However, because, and it introduced this in part 1 here, because the risk-free asset has no risk, that's its definition, right? It's risk-free. So risk, and we are going to use the metric of risk or standard deviation is equal to 0. Okay. The determination of the risk of the portfolio is nothing other than how much we have invested in the risky asset. So no matter where we sit on the line, whether we sit here or whether we sit here, we can determine the expected return. Okay, so the expected return here and here is going to be determined by this relationship, right? But the standard deviation, right? The standard deviation is determined by this relationship. And the standpoint is that we do not have any covariance, we don't have any correlation, we don't have any risk of the risk-free asset, and so all those numbers are 0. So calculating, okay, calculating the risk of a portfolio that is a little bit more straightforward, because at the end of the day, it's nothing other than how much weight or how much money you have invested of your total portfolio, okay, invested in that risky portfolio, And that is the standard deviation and that is the risk because why? The risk-free asset is risk-free, and therefore, by definition, it doesn't have any risk, and therefore, it doesn't have any standard deviation. Okay. So the idea, though, that comes into play, though, is that we can have a bunch of different assets, right? And we can have a bunch of different assets. Now, we had introduced the concept of efficiency, all right, and the efficient frontier and all that. We're not there yet. Again, we just introduced that from a generalized perspective. Because, remember, the efficient portfolio, the efficient frontier, okay, and the efficient frontier, that concept of efficiency indicates the portfolio that is what? That generates the highest rate of return at every unit of risk, or the lowest risk measure at every desired rate of return. Well, within that, in those dominated portfolios and those inefficient portfolios, you can still invest in them. It might not be optimal. You can still invest in them. It might not be optimal. And you can still invest between that risky portfolio and a risk-free asset, which is what you see here. Yeah, what you see here. So we have three risky portfolios, A, B, and C. And if we just connect that line, the expected return standard deviation between a risk-free asset or the risk-free asset, okay, not a risk-free asset, but the risk-free asset, to each one, what you'll see is we can generate capital allocation lines, okay, we can generate capital allocation lines. Remember now, we're still in expected return standard deviation space. Okay, we're staying in that expected return total risk type of perspective. All right? And the indifference curve is what? That's your utility curve, right? You get the same, okay, you get the same utility here as you do here, right? Well, the idea is that, well, there is no portfolio here and there is no portfolio. Those are what? Unfeasible. They're infeasible. They don't exist in the real world. Okay, they don't exist in the real world. So the best that we can do, okay, the best we can do is essentially choose that portfolio. Okay, choose the portfolio that gives us the highest, okay, that gives us the highest utility, right? Gives us the highest utility that's tangent to the capital allocation line of, in this case, it just happens to be portfolio A. And you say to yourself, well, why do I want that one? Well, we can have an indifference curve here, right? We have a lower utility here because utility increases this way, okay? And we have a lower utility here, so this would be your utility, this indifference curve 2, or in this particular case, it's indifference curve B. But we would never choose that, right? Because why? All we have to do is make a choice between portfolio A and the risk-free. Because why? Because we get higher utility. So in this idea, all right, this capital allocation line is nothing other than the connection. It's just the line that connects what? The risk-free asset to a risky portfolio or a risky asset. And any and all risky portfolios and risky assets can have that capital allocation line. Why? Because we can make an investment in a risky portfolio, a portion of our portfolio in a risky asset, and then a portion in a risk-free asset. So, I mean, the idea is that there's not one capital allocation line, all right? There's many capital allocation lines because of the standpoint that the definition is nothing other than risk return between a risky and a risk-free. That's all it is. The problem though is that, you know, this gets to be kind of onerous, right? We have all these risky portfolios out here, we have all these risky assets, we can make all those lines connected to, and we can generate all these capital allocation lines. Really the one we want is what? We want the one that gives us the highest utility, which is going to be what? It's going to be the one that has the highest capital allocation line slope, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But at the end of the day, what you want to remember, okay, what you want to remember is that in expected return, standard deviation space, and I say space, I just mean, think of the expected return as being the y-axis and standard deviation, the total risk, as being the x-axis. When you just look at things from those two perspectives, you want to be as northwest in that quadrant as possible. You'd like to be up here. Hey, you'd like to be up here. The problem is what? We mentioned in part 1 that those are infeasible. They don't exist. We can't attain that. I mean, we'd all love to have what? $5 million a minute by doing what? Watching TV, right? I mean, that would be pretty cool if you could just get that money coming in without having to do anything. But I don't think it's desirable. It's infeasible in the standpoint that it just doesn't exist in the real world. So we want to be as high northwest, or as far as northwest as possible in this quadrant, all right, in this quadrant of feasible portfolios, all right? And so what we're going to do, and so instead of having all these different capital allocation lines, although I just want to reiterate this point that any risky portfolio, any risky asset, we can actually generate a capital allocation line, because all we have to do is make a connection or invest a portion of our portfolio into risky and a portion of our portfolio into risk-free. So we don't need, okay, we don't need to, you don't need to know, you don't need to really get concerned too much about which one, except for the one that we want to have the highest utility. Okay, and that is the ultimate objective. The problem is that we have all these different investors out there. They have all their expectations about returns, standard deviation, covariance, correlations, etc., etc. It just kind of makes things messy. So what we'd like to be able to do, is to provide some assumptions. And we're going to talk more about some of these assumptions later, but there's a couple of assumptions that we can apply directly to the available portfolio of assets out there, the investment opportunity set, that makes this problem a little bit more tractable, a little bit more straightforward. And one of the assumptions that we can make, is this concept of of homogeneous expectations. Homogeneous expectations is nothing other than the standpoint is that investor A and investor B look at 5 different portfolios. They look at 5 different assets. And what they see is expected return of asset A, asset B, asset C, asset D, asset E. They see standard deviations for asset A through E, and then they see correlations and covariances between AB, AC, AD, etc., all the way through. And what they do, when you think of homogeneous expectations, that means that those two investors have the same expectation. They have the same expected return, they have the same expected risk, they have the same expected covariance correlation. So what that means, and what that means when we have that situation is that as investor A and B and C and D, all the way to all the investors out in the marketplace, essentially they do what? They see the same efficient frontier. They see the same portfolios available. They see the same investment opportunity set. Why? Because they have the same expectations. So even if you have 500 assets, and you have 500 assets, all investors see the same expected return, standard deviation, covariance amongst all the different pairs that are available. Okay, of portfolios that you can form with those 500 different assets. Now that might be somewhat of a stretch. It might be somewhat of a stretch, but you don't need to worry too much about that, because originally, at the end of the day, we can relax that and we still get the same results that we get here. But the key to remember, is that what happens, what happens when everybody sees and has the same expectations, they see the same efficient frontier. Okay, they see the same efficient frontier. And at any particular moment in time, there's only one risk-free return. There's only one for risk-free asset, right? I mean, because technically, if you had a risk-free asset here, you would take that one. If you had one here, you would take that one, right? So from that aspect, we're just focusing, on the risk-free asset that's available. Okay, so what we see, if we make a connection, if we draw a line between the risk-free asset and our risky portfolio that everybody sees, and you say to yourself, well, how does everybody see it? Because they have homogeneous expectations. They've generated this efficient frontier. And And when we draw that line, that capital allocation line, you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, John, you have this labeled capital market line. I don't understand. Well, wait, remember, what was the definition of capital allocation line? Capital allocation line is the risk-return combination between a risk-free asset and a portfolio of risky asset. It's the same idea. But when we allow or we state and we assume that investors have homogeneous expectations, that risky portfolio has a special name. It's called the market portfolio. And everybody has homogeneous expectations of all the individual assets that are available in the marketplace. And they see that risky portfolio. And essentially, that portfolio that connects to the risk-free return, which happens to be tangible. And therefore, that capital allocation line then turns into what we call the capital market line. And therefore, all we really need to focus on, okay, all we really need to focus on is investing in this market portfolio, okay, which contains all available assets out there in their appropriate weightings, and technically they're in their market value weightings, but we don't need to get there just yet. Okay, so instead of having to figure out, should we choose this asset, or should we choose this asset, or should we choose this portfolio, or should we choose this portfolio? No, we don't worry about that. All we do is we look at the risk-free asset and we draw the line that tangents to the efficient frontier, and that essentially determines what our market portfolio is. And therefore, all we really need to do then is focus on investing here and here. All we need to do, if we have homogeneous expectations, then the capital market line that we see here is it's trying to figure out whether we're going to be sitting here or whether we're going to be sitting here. In this case, if we sit right here, i.e. tangent to the efficient frontier, we have 100% of our portfolio invested in what? In the market. If we sit around, let's say, just think of expanding dot theorem. If we sit around there, we have 50% invested in a risky portfolio and 50% invested in a risk-free asset. So the idea comes into play is like, well, wow, wait a minute, what does all that mean? And why do I want to do that? Why do I want to allow for homogeneous expectations? And why do I kind of want to have this idea? And why do I want to have this idea of investing in the market portfolio and investing in the risk-free asset? Well, there's a couple of background pieces of information that help this idea. Okay, and that help this idea. That help this idea from a capital market line perspective. Remember, in capital market line, just like capital allocation line, we are in expected return standard deviation space. The y-axis is expected return. Standard deviation is the x-axis, right? So what we want to think about, it from a market portfolio perspective. A market portfolio perspective. We can decompose that standard deviation, just like we can decompose total return into at least a change in value and a flow component. We can decompose that standard deviation into at least these two components, systematic and unsystematic risk. Now, some people call this unsystematic risk, they call it non-systematic risk, or they call it firm-specific risk. Don't get too worried about it. I like to think of it this way. I like to think of systematic or market risk, and I like to think of non-systematic or firm-specific risk, i.e. the risk that's not encompassed by the market. When we think about systematic risk, now, I want to just bring something to your attention because a lot of people talk about this in the press, and I think they get these words confused. Systematic and systemic are not the same thing. Okay? They're not the same thing. When we think about systematic, it's essentially factors that are impacting the system. When we think about systemic, it's like the system. There's something wrong with the system, or at least there's some risks because of the way our system is created. But try not to get too confused about that. I say that because a lot of people in the press use the phrase systemic and they use the phrase systematic in the same sentence, and they're trying to say the same thing, and they're not. Okay, they're not. So just to bring that to your attention. So what are these systematic risks? Okay, what are these systematic risks? Well, these are factors that are going to impact the entire market. And that's the reason why I like to call that market risk. Right? Okay, and because generally speaking, we can all agree. And maybe we disagree, okay? But we can all pretty much agree that if the macro economy is sick, all right, it's not doing well, then it's going to be hard for the stock market or any asset market to do well, right? So essentially, those factors that are indicative, and again, these factors that we're talking about, these macro factors, are just metrics of the overall economy, right? They don't say anything specific. They just are indicative of whether or not the overall economy is doing well, or is doing better, or if it's doing worse. And again, everything is a comparison, right? It's all relative, right? So the idea is that what are some of those factors that are going to be impacting, and what are some of those factors that are going to impact your overall economy? Interest rates are, I think we can all agree, and maybe some people will say that they don't impact problems. If interest rates fall substantially, then borrowing rates are low. GDP growth. I mean, that's an indicator of the overall economy, right? The more the economic activity is going on, probably the better profit opportunities are available. Firms will have opportunities to generate stock returns for their investors, etc. So, even though we might disagree as to what I guess what proportion of the overall macroeconomic activity impacts individual firms, I think we can all agree that, if the body is sick, okay, if the body is sick, i.e. if the overall economy is sick, okay, or is really healthy, then the hand and the legs and the feet are going to be better positioned to take advantage of the environment. From a market perspective, if the overall economy is doing well, the individual firms and industries in the economy are going to have an opportunity to generate, I would say, more positive type results. And maybe that's kind of the idea. That's just, I know it's kind of nefarious, but think of it this way. When we talk about market risk, just think about the standpoint is that you're on an island. Okay, and if a tidal wave comes, it hits you, and it doesn't matter where you are on the island, okay, you're going to get hit. So when we talk about these macroeconomic factors, those are generalized factors that impact the overall economy, right? I'm going to get back to how we measure it in just a second, but let's move now to, so these market risk factors are those that impact the entire market. These firm-specific factors, are going to be those factors that are risk variables that impact individual firms, okay, that impact individual firms. So the idea... Hey, the idea is that nothing, you should realize, yes, interest rate, economic activity, unemployment is probably going to impact, individual firms, right? But they impact all individual firms. These firm-specific risk factors are firm-specific. And what I mean by that, this is the type of product that they do. Think of a firm that is in the pharmaceutical industry and comes up with a drug. They're the only one that comes up with this drug, and it's a wonderful drug. Everybody loves it, and it's all great. And all of a sudden, 5 years after it's out, and before the patent runs out, everybody figures out that, oh wow, people who take that drug now grow a third arm. Wow, that's going to be a problem, right? Because not any other firm does that drug. So that's a firm-specific issue. The key that you should remember, okay, and the key that you should remember about firm-specific or non-systematic or unsystematic risk is that we can eliminate or substantially reduce, and we'll show a graph about this in just a second, substantially reduce firm-specific risk very easily and at low cost, okay? Very easily and at low cost. And you say to yourself, well, why am I worried about that? Okay, why am I worried about that? Because technically what you should recognize in this whole concept of portfolio theory and portfolio concepts is that only the systematic or market risk is going to be rewarded by expected returns. And you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, no, I have firm-specific risks that I want to be rewarded for. That's true, but since you can easily eliminate that firm-specific risk from a capital market theory perspective, overall portfolio formation perspective, it's very easy to eliminate those firm-specific issues. And therefore, since that can be eliminated, you're not going to be rewarded for them. All right? So let's get back to this. How do we measure that now? All right, so key, systematic risk, unsystematic risk, market risk, firm-specific risk, okay, two big pieces, all right? And that only that systematic risk component of our total risk is really what's going to be rewarded with higher expected returns. And how do we formulate that market risk measure, and how do we, I guess if you want to get an indication of, how do we come up with a number? Well, that is the measure, okay? We measure market risk by the covariance of returns with the returns on the market portfolio. So you have an individual asset, and you have the market, and we've said what the market is, right? Because we've allowed for homogeneous expectations to come into play, and everybody sees all the same assets, they have the same expectations, etc., and we see that market portfolio. Okay, so any individual portfolio, any potential asset, okay, that we want to add to a portfolio, we can measure its covariance with that return of the market, right? That's the idea. Now, to get back to the firm-specific risk and the issue of why item number 3 is so important, okay, why item number 3 is so important, is represented on this particular slide. Here's the idea. Here's the market risk is rewarded with higher expected returns because of the ease of diversification that we have out there in the marketplace. So without getting too specific about the mathematics behind all this, but you can still kind of formulate what? How do I determine this standard deviation? Well, that's just that standard deviation of the portfolio of a bunch of different individual assets, right? So if we plot on the y-axis, all right, the standard deviation, all right, and then on the x-axis, n, which is the number of securities, right? We can just take two randomly generated, or just one randomly generated, not generated, but just grab an individual asset by itself, all right? And then just grab a random second asset, put it together in a portfolio. Then get a third one, put it together in a portfolio. And then a fourth one and put it together in a portfolio. Randomly, okay, randomly. Essentially what you'll see, is that you can generate this concept of total risk, right? You can generate this concept of total risk as a function of how many securities you have in your portfolio, okay? How many securities you have in your portfolio. And if we just do that randomly, grab one asset, grab two assets, three assets, four assets, five assets, and create portfolios with differential number of assets, okay, in the portfolio, what we're going to see is this real interesting concept here, okay? We're going to see this real interesting concept. And this concept is going to be nothing on the order of is that the total risk is going to start to decline. What you'll see is your sigma, which just starts to go down. Okay, it starts to go down. And that's what you're seeing on this graph right here. And that's what you're seeing on this graph. The problem is that after a certain number of securities, however, that total risk number just essentially, no matter how many assets you have in a portfolio, essentially stays the same. Okay, essentially stays the same. And that's not technically correct because you can always reduce it. Okay, you can always reduce it, but the amount of reduction gets so small. Okay, the amount of reduction gets so small that it's really not worth. Okay, it's really not worth having like more than maybe 30. Now, depending upon which article you read, it might be indicative of about 50 securities in a portfolio that you minimize. You minimize your total risk. And what I mean by minimize is that we can't reduce our total risk with any meaningful fashion just by throwing in another security, all right? And so what happens there, is we find that we hit this asymptote, okay? And that's the reason why you see the horizontal line as being kind of dashed, right? The horizontal line. And what we mean by that is that we don't have any, there's no more, we can't have any benefit of diversification anymore, right? Why? Because we've eliminated all the firm-specific risk, and now the only risk of what we have exposure to is the systematic risk or the market risk. The idea is that, let's just suppose you're on that island. Okay, let's just suppose you're on that island. On that island, you have like 10 companies, and those 10 companies on that island they're in different kinds of businesses, right? Well, you can reduce the risk of the travel-related type of businesses with the businesses that are connected with agriculture and the businesses that are connected with financial services and the businesses that are connected with banking, right? You can because the touristy business is really going to be, it's going to be impacted by a lot of different factors than the banking business, right? But all 10 of these companies are going to be impacted by what? They're going to be impacted by that tidal wave that hit the market. So when we think about diversification and firm-specific risk, okay, when we think about diversification, firm-specific risk, what we are doing is that we are reducing total risk to the point that the only risk we have exposure to is to that of the tidal wave. Okay? Our total risk is that risk associated with those systematic factors. It's going to be those factors that each and all of the securities on the island are going to be impacted, i.e., when you have stocks, you're impacted by the overall market and the factors that impact the overall market. And you say to yourself, well, wait a minute. So you get back to the idea that you talked about on the previous slide about this concept of that only systematic risk is rewarded with higher expected returns, and my statement was yes, because diversification is so easy to accomplish. And you say, well, how easy is that to accomplish? Well, we've already kind of showed here, right? Well, we can just randomly pick securities. And we can randomly pick securities. And portfolio somewhere between the number of 30 and 50 will have what? They'll have them determined by the amount of market risk that you have, okay? About a market risk that you have. So essentially, we can reduce risk all the way up to quote-unquote, the standard deviation of the market. Beyond that, we can't reduce it through diversification. And some people say, well, we can hedge away the risk. Yeah, but we're not talking about derivatives right now. We're just talking about solely specifically how do we reduce that total risk exposure. All right? So when we think of total risk, remember, and we think of total risk, it is equal to the firm-specific risk plus the systematic risk. And essentially, we can, for all intents and purposes, and when we form a well-diversified portfolio, we are reducing, we're reducing this firm-specific risk component, to a negligible or very close to a zero amount. Okay. So when we think about all these different kinds of return ideas and factors, return factors and market type of impacts, all right. And we want to essentially what we want to try and do is indicate, or at least formulate in our heads, what are those quote unquote market factors? Well, the easiest way to think about it is that the market factors, all those systematic factors can be encompassed into a single risk factor, which we call the market, right? So the return on the market is going to have an impact on the return on individual securities. Return on the market is going to, if you think about it, it's going to have an effect on the return of any individual security. So when we think about that, these factors can have an impact on the return of an individual asset. The simplest way to do it, or at least step one we can do, is we can think of it as though those factors are subsumed by the overall market, and the overall market then has an effect on the return of the individual assets. Okay, so what we're talking about here is what we call, in a mathematical term, in an econometric term, a statistical term, is what we call the market model. And the market model indicates nothing other than a single risk factor, which is the return on the market, is essentially going to be impacting and determining and having an effect on the individual return of an asset. And that quote-unquote effect, that quote-unquote effect is going to be measured by the asset's beta. And we'll talk about that in just a second, in the asset's beta. But for the moment, what we're doing is that we have these economic factors, these systematic factors, and we're going to encompass them and measure their effect on individual return on assets through the return of the market. And that quote-unquote effect is going to be measured by the sensitivity of that individual asset to the movement of the market. And that sensitivity is what we're going to call beta. Now, in a few slides, we're going to clarify what that beta is, but just think of this, that there's a relationship between the return on the market and the return on individual assets, and that relationship is determined by the sensitivity of how that individual asset moves with the market, moves in the market. Now, generally speaking, this is just kind of a technical piece off to the side. This last bullet here, when we talk about these return-generating models, because in a second we're going to talk about a little bit more general terms. Well, these return-generating models, essentially, we're going to indicate that asset returns are going to be a linear function of market returns, and so there's a linear relationship, right? Even though they may be nonlinear, for the moment we're just going to stick with the concept of a linear connection between return on individual assets, and these indicators of return, which we'll call systematic factors, right? So the market model, right? The market model is what we call a single factor model. It's a very specific case, of these return generating models that that can be richer, in the description. The richer in the description, the more complicated they get. But what you should think is that multi-factor models and single factor models, essentially they're all saying essentially the same thing, right? Right? There are factors. There are factors, systematic factors, systematic factors that what? Determine the return of individual asset. All right, and you say to yourself, well, what do you mean by return? What you're saying is that there are economic factors, systematic factors that are connected to the returns of individual assets. Beta, and you say, well, wait a minute, you called beta the sensitivity measured to the market, and that's true. That's true. That's another one of the things that I want to make sure you're clear about. technically, whenever a lot of pundits in the press use the term beta, and they just roll right off of their tongue, and they say, oh, well, there's beta risk there. Well, what does that mean? In the simplest of terms, when we talk about beta, we're talking about sensitivity to systematic factors. Okay, sensitivity to systematic factors. And so from that aspect, these betas are nothing other than factor sensitivities. If you go back to the single market model or the market model, right, the beta, there's only one beta, and the sensitivity is only one factor, and that's the return of the market. Well, when we have multiple factor models, we can have what? Multiple factors that impact the return of individual assets. And a lot of people say to themselves, well, that seems to be more logical. And true, it is, because the world is not a simple place. It's pretty complex. Okay? But when we get models that encompass more information, they just become more complicated. All right, they just become more complicated. So these betas, when we talk about beta, generally speaking, what you're talking about or what's being referred to, and unfortunately sometimes in the popular press is being referred to incorrectly, but what the attempt is being made that the beta is a measure of sensitivity to systematic or market factors, meaning those factors that are going to be impacting the entire market. Okay, those factors are going to be impacting the entire market. So that from that aspect, that's the idea. Now, the additional complication comes into the the discussion is that what are those factors? Well, we have various types of models that we can have. We can have various types of factors. We can have macroeconomic factors, we can have fundamental factors, and we can have what we call statistical factors. And just the general idea what you should recognize is that, right, the macroeconomic factors are very similar to the systematic factors that we talked about previously whenever we discussed the whole concept of systematic risk. Not systemic, but systematic risk, right? And that's GDP, employment, interest rates, etc. I mean, you as the analyst have to decide that. You have to make a choice as to, A, how many you're going to have and what they're going to be, right? And so you can run a model and you can do that test and you can see that there's some sensitivity. Sometimes you see more sensitivity on various factors during certain time periods than you do others. So there's some time variability, but don't worry about that. When we think about macroeconomic multi-factor models, so that's kind of, it's fun to say, but it's a little difficult to say because it's macroeconomic multi-factor models. Essentially, is indicative of the standpoint that you believe that these macroeconomic factors are driving returns, okay, or driving returns on individual assets. And they drive the returns on all assets, right, because they're systematic factors. Okay. We also have fundamental factor multi-factor models, right, where we, instead of those factors, those F's that you see here that I've just marked with the arrow, okay, F's that you see that were marked with the arrow, instead of those being GDP, employment, inflation, interest rates, etc., okay, it would be fundamental issues, earnings growth, size, okay, R&D, something that you believe, okay, something that you believe is going to be impacting the return of an individual asset. Those are, I guess they're from a historical perspective and an academic perspective, they're a little bit newer on the scene. But in some aspects, they're older because the standpoint is that whenever you go from a fundamental analyst perspective, that's been around a little bit longer. The actual implementation of those. And then finally, we have these statistical factors. Okay? And these statistical factors these are the fun ones, really. I like to think, because of the standpoint that these statistical factors, even though there's no basis in financial theory for these, okay, essentially what it says is that returns are sensitive to stuff, right? And I know that's a highly technical term, but those factors, they're just a factor out there, and we don't know what the factor is, and we don't know how many they are. We just postulate that that it's probably not just one factor, and we don't necessarily know whether it's GDP or whether it's earnings growth that's impacted. We're just going to let the data speak for itself. And so these statistical factors, these factor models, what they call those, was using factor analysis to, okay, is that nothing else is that we have all this data and we have the relationship between the return of individual assets and the relationship of a bunch of different variables, and then these factors come about. We don't know how many they really are, we can see some statistical significance, but we really don't know how many they are, and we really don't know what they are. They're just these factors that are rolling out. So essentially, think of it as being this way. The statistical factor kind of idea is that returns are a function of stuff. We just don't know what the stuff is, and we don't know how much of that stuff is out there. But these macroeconomic and fundamental factors, we have to define those a priori before we do our analysis. All right? Well, there's a couple of special return generating models out there in the marketplace, and many of you have probably heard about these, the Fama French models. And think of this: Fama French came out with what we call a three-factor model, and that essentially, remember, if you go back to the multi-factor models, it says that what? There's a factor out there that causes movement, or a factor that causes the asset is sensitive to different factors, and the three factors that are postulated in the Fama French three-factor model are firm size, okay, book to market, okay, and excess return on the market portfolio. So let's just go back to a second. I'm going to highlight this one just for a minute because of the standpoint we're going to spend a little bit more time on this issue a little bit later. Because the Fama French three-factor model includes these three factors: size, book to market, which is kind of an indication of style, right? Value versus growth kind of concept. And then excess return on the market. So the market, it's really hard to, whenever the market goes down 20%, it's really hard for your asset not to move. And I might move in a positive direction because it's a countervailing asset, but the bottom line is when the market's moving a lot, probably individual stocks are also moving. Now, so when we think of this firm size, and a lot of people will see this, and a lot of people may have seen this, and I just kind of want to kind of put a little bit more meat on the piece here, and that's what we call this SMB factor. Okay. Some people say it's the low minus high or the high minus low, HML factor, and then this is nothing other than the return of the market minus the risk-free rate, and then Carhart added a fourth factor, i.e. momentum, okay, and this is nothing other than MOM. Okay, and it's nothing other than MOM. This is an idea. This is an idea is that when the market is moving, okay, and the market is moving, then there's momentum, and there's momentum for individual assets. Then that's going to have an impact on the expected return of that individual asset. So that's the idea. So size has an effect. Okay. Its value versus growth style characteristic has an effect. The overall excess return of the market has an effect, and the movement or momentum of the stock also has effect. And what we see here is that these models tend to generate a better explanatory power, just in that single index market model that we talked about previously. But these are just in generalized terms. Okay, these are just in generalized terms. And the idea I'm trying to get you to think about, is that yes, we have this single market model, and okay, what is it? It just indicates that the expected return of a stock is sensitive to the return of the market. But really, the return of the market really doesn't do what? It doesn't give us very much information, right? So we kind of allow more information to come into play, and we have these multi-factor models, but these multi-factor models get a little bit more complex. Sometimes we have to formulate what the economic variables are. Sometimes we have to formulate what the fundamental variables are. Maybe we don't even know what that is, so we go ahead and allow some statistical factors to do the explanatory power, or we can use the Fama French three-factor model, and it's like, oh, all of a sudden I have all these models out there. But that's just the idea, is that what we would like to do as investors from a portfolio management perspective is to do, ultimately, we want to do what? We want to choose a security. We want to choose a portfolio. And in order to be able to do that, we want to choose it easily and from a diversified perspective, because it's really easy and costless. Well, it's maybe not costless, it's very low cost to create a diversified portfolio of risky securities. So let's kind of go back to the whole idea I mentioned previously. Let's just go back to the idea. How do we calculate this beta? Okay, well, what does that mean? Okay, what does that mean, this beta? What is it? Well, the sensitivity, right? The sensitivity of the asset to individual returns, subtract the risk-free rate, and just think of excess returns, okay, against the market excess return. You'll see here is that this dot means that the security had this return at the same time the market had this return. And then if we plot this dot, that means the security had this return while the market had this return. This dot said that the security had this return while the market had this return. That's all that these dots are meaning, all right? That's all these dots are meaning. Essentially what we're doing is that we're doing a plot and then we run a regression, okay? Then we run a regression. Statistical package essentially doing nothing other than does what? Tries to fit a line, okay? Tries to fit a line, the best fit line, which we'll call the asset characteristic line. The slope of that line is the beta. Okay, the slope of that line is the beta. And I don't want to get into too much detail only because the standpoint is that whenever all we're trying to do on this slide is to get you an idea is, well, how do we come up with that beta? Okay, well, let's generate it. Okay, i.e., how do we come up with that sensitivity measure? Well, let's just generate it by running a regression and then formulating and making connections between sensitivity of the individual security to movements in the market. Okay, and we do that sensitivity measure, or we calculate that sensitivity measure with nothing other than doing a regression, i.e., which is nothing other than trying to fit a line that best describes the movement. It best describes the movement of data. And I know what you're about to say now. Oh no, look at all these formulas. Well, technically, beta is a whole lot easier than you think. Okay, the beta is a whole lot easier than you think to calculate. Than having to run all these complicated statistical type of packages. Technically, beta is nothing other than the covariance of the individual asset with the market divided by the variance of the market. Okay, and that's the of an individual security. And a beta of any portfolio is nothing other than a weighted average of the betas of the stocks in that portfolio. Okay, and you'd say to yourself, well, what does that mean? Okay, what does that mean? Well, technically, how do I get that? Okay, how do I get this result? I mean, that's the end result. Okay, how do I get that end result? Right? Well, really, there's all kinds of different ways that we can see that, and there's all kinds of different ways that we can see that. Right? When we have the correlation of a stock with the market, okay, we have a correlation of stock with the market. I mean, we can. I guess the idea which you should think about is, well, wait a minute, what are the different ways that I can think of this sensitivity measure? Because think of what this sensitivity measure is, right? And think of what covariance is, right? Covariance is nothing other than an indication of movement, right? Not necessarily an indication of strength of movement, but just an indication of movement, right? And then we're going to standardize that by the variance of the market. So beta is a standardized measure of co-movement of an individual asset with the market given the variance of the market. Okay, given the variance of the market. So that's what makes that measure of sensitivity really a cool sensitivity measure. And in a second I'll show you a really cool result. Okay. In that beta really does give us an indication of how sensitive is our stock to movement in the overall market. And that's what beta is trying to tell you. Okay? And you say to yourself, well, I don't like covariance. I like to think of it in terms of correlation. Well, you can, right? You can think in terms of correlation, and we can have this same formula just decomposed in this manner because the covariance of the market, okay, covariance of the market divided by what? The standard deviation of the asset and the market is what? That is correlation. Okay, that is correlation. And you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, there's something else there. That's true, there is. And if we, and you say, well, man, this is kind of like algebraic manipulation. Yeah, that's right. That's all it is. All right? But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to indicate to you is you can think of it in terms of correlation, or you can think of it in terms of co-movement. Okay? Think of it in terms of co-movement. So if we just multiply in the numerator, okay, we just multiply in the numerator the variance of, the standard deviation, okay, of what's in the denominator, i.e. of the standardizing factor for the correlation coefficient, okay, and then we multiply, okay, that ratio of that standard deviation of the stock to the standard deviation of the overall market. Essentially, what we do is we get this result. Okay, essentially we get this result. Don't get too hung up about the algebra. Okay, don't get too hung up about the algebra. Just think of what it's telling. It is a measure of what? Sensitivity of co-movement between an asset and the market relative to the variance or the movement in the marketplace, right? So that's the idea. But that second row right there just gives you a bunch of different ways you can kind of think of it. And that from an algebraic perspective, they're all correct. And, you know, I like to tell people it's a different way to view. Okay, it's a different way to view. Because when you think about it from a correlation perspective, is you have the correlation, and then you're just adjusting that correlation by what? The proportion of variability of the individual asset divided by the variability of the market. That's kind of the idea. But here's that key result that I wanted to give you an indication of earlier. The beta of the market. This is a special beta out there in the marketplace, and to begin with the end in mind, it's equal to 1. Okay, it's equal to 1. And you say to yourself, well, how do you know that? Well, any correlation of any asset with itself is equal to 1, right? I mean, you know, when you look in the mirror, you're a reflection of you, right? So you're correlated with yourself, 1. Okay. And then when we make those adjustments by using this formula that we had in the second row here, well, that's the standard deviation of the asset, or in this case, it's the market, of which relative to the standard deviation of the market. Well, that's 1. So when we think about a beta of 1, this is the great idea behind all this capital market theory. In the standpoint, and in a second, we'll call this specific line a special number. I mean, we'll call this line, the slope here, a special name. Is that whenever we think about beta equal to 1, it's the numeraire. We can compare all returns, okay? We can compare all returns and all risks, okay, to the risk of the market. All right, and so when we think about the beta of the market, we think of that as being a very fundamental numeraire. It's equal to 1. So that kind of like gives you a mark in the middle. And then you make comparisons relative to that. And so that really is, okay, that really is a beautiful result. Okay, and I know you're saying to yourself, wow, you must be a real geek, John, because you're stating its beauty. That is because all risk can then be compared in relative terms to the overall risk of the market. And that's one of the benefits of capital market theory and portfolio theory. Okay, capital market theory and portfolio theory. That's one of the insights that we get there. All right, it's one of the insights that we get there. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details about all these different assumptions, because essentially we're doing this to make us, or to make the analysis and the mathematics, just a little bit more tractable. So if we use the mean variance framework, i.e. we form portfolios, okay, we form portfolios using expected return, standard deviation space, we formulate that efficient frontier. We're able to lend and borrow at the risk-free rate. And, you know, you say to yourself, well, in real terms, we can't necessarily borrow at the risk-free rate. We can probably lend at the risk-free rate. That's true. But, again, don't get too worried and hung up about some of these assumptions. A lot of academic evidence of some of this stuff, and when we relax it, it still gives us the same result. Okay? If we have homogeneous expectations, one period time horizon, frictionless markets, no inflation, capital markets in equilibrium, they're quote-unquote no price makers, or everybody's a price taker out there. The market kind of generates everything. The big result that comes out of capital market theory, once we throw in these assumptions on top of some really basic ideas, is what we call the capital asset pricing model. Okay, this is the CAP-M. Okay, this is the CAP-M. And that CAP-M, all right, that CAP-M essentially is also what we call the security market line. Now, the security market line equation can be connected, or in some ways, how would I say, parallel to the capital market line type of equation, because of the standpoint of what? Okay, when we are in the capital allocation and capital market line space, we're doing what? Expected returns on the y-axis, but on the x-axis is total risk. Well, now that we've assumed that we can diversify all that firm-specific risk, we throw in all those other assumptions about homogeneous expectations, price taking, divisible assets, frictionless markets, equilibrium, etc., etc. Then we move into not expected return standard deviation space, but expected return beta space. And again, beta is that measure of systematic risk, and it is what? Is the standardized covariance. Okay, and it's standardized by what? Of the assets return, co-movement of the assets return of the market by the standard deviation or the variance of the overall market. This capital asset pricing model is going to come in real handy. And as a king of the hill out there, and the standpoint is that maybe it doesn't determine all and define all risk and return, okay, because it's a single factor model, technically, okay, but really it does a great job, okay, it does a great job. So when we think about this, and I've already stated some of these points here, but I just want to I guess, reiterate them and bring them back to you. So, capital asset pricing model indicates that expected return on an asset is what? Based solely on the asset systematic risk, or its beta. Okay? There's no firm-specific characteristic that's going to determine the expected return on the asset. Okay? And whenever we use the capital asset pricing model, we can use it to determine the required return, okay, on an asset based on what? Based on beta. And that the required and the expected return in equilibrium, okay, are the same. Are the same. You say to yourself, well, do I really need to know that? Well, yeah, because of the standpoint as particular investors, we'd like to know. Okay, we'd like to know whether or not the information of the capital asset pricing model and our own forecasts are in cahoots, or are telling the same story. Okay, are telling the same story, and that's really powerful, I think. Okay. Now, when I made an indication that the security market line and the capital market line, we can kind of think of them in the same vein in parallel structures. But when we mean security market, when we discuss security market line, we're talking about expected return versus beta. So this is the y-axis and this is the x-axis, where in the capital market line, the capital allocation line, the x-axis is what? Standard deviation, is total risk. So whenever I went back and I said, this is the cool part about the capital asset pricing model, or cool part about capital market theory is that, excuse me, the beta of the market is equal to 1 because its sensitivity, relative to itself, is equal to 1. And that means that we can have this direct connection between the the beta of an asset, and, the beta of the market and the return of the market. We can also have, assets that sit on the security market line if they are determined by the capital asset pricing model and the capital asset pricing model. Everything is what? Risk is determined relative to what? To the market. So if this is asset B, and this is asset A, essentially we can know what the expected return of asset A is relative to its beta risk, and it's less risky than the market, and therefore its return should be less than the market. Asset B, on the other hand, has higher risk than the market, and therefore its return should be greater than the market. But the beautiful thing about having the capital asset pricing model and this concept of beta is that everything can be determined in reference relative to the market. B is riskier than the market. A is not as risky as the market, which is a pretty cool idea. And then on the flip side, I say from an actual implementation perspective, the capital asset pricing model provides us a framework to calculate specific numbers. We move away from the nefarious assumptions and theoretical bases into, wow, what is a number? What is a number? And you're going to see this, I think you're going to see this just a lot of times in your financial studies, because of the standpoint that, all this says here, this is the expected return, and this is the risk-free rate, and this is beta, and this is the return of the market minus risk-free rate. That's all it is the capital asset pricing model. The beautiful thing about the model is and I don't mean to be I don't mean to be facetious when I say this, but it pretty much is a plug and chug, right? You know the inputs, got the risk-free rate, you know the beta, you know the return of the market, or at least we have expectation of return of the market, and it's just plug and chug. Multiply everything out, subtract everything out, add, boom, we get our expected return. All right. So here's this example here. Let's suppose a stock has a beta of 1.2, expected return on the market is 8%, risk-free rate is 2%. What's the stock's expected return? Well, we know a couple of things right away, right? Or you should remember, right? This stock's beta is 1.2, which is, it's greater than 1. So that means our return on that stock should be greater than the market, which is at 8. And we see that. We see that right there as at 9.2. Okay? In equilibrium, that expected return and the required return in the market should be equal. So we can formulate, what the and what the model says relative to expected returns what the model says relative to required returns as to what we might expect, because we might not think things are exactly the way that they should be, and we can formulate our own expectations. But in equilibrium, if everything is all-encompassed, everything's taken into account, the expected and required returns, the expected and required returns should be equal. which then helps us have an idea about what kind of applications can we use this capital asset pricing model for. Okay. One of the first applications, now we're going to do a couple of these, right? And I don't want you to get too, how would I say, too caught up with all the math here, right? And too caught up with all the math here. But the first application that we're going to talk about is calculating risk-adjusted return measures. Because as I indicated previously, when we are calculating returns, we have to take into account risk, right? We have to take into account risk. So we can use the capital asset pricing model and some of its offshoots to give us an indication about return per unit of risk. All right. So here is a situation where we have a couple of portfolios. We've got portfolio 1, okay, and we've got portfolio 2. And these capital allocation lines, remember now, what is capital allocation line? It's nothing other than a line segment connecting the risky asset to the risk-free security. Okay, so we have Portfolio 1's capital allocation line and Portfolio 2's capital allocation line. Notice that Portfolio 1's capital allocation line is the same capital allocation line as the market, which we will call what? The capital market line. Capital allocation line of Portfolio 2, kind of interesting perspective, right? Because if we had homogeneous expectations, everything would be there. Well, let's just make a supposition that that particular asset's new on the marketplace. It doesn't get incorporated yet, and we're trying to figure out, well, is that thing worth it from a risk-return perspective? And our slopes now, remember, what is a slope? That's just rise over run. Okay, the slope of the capital allocation is just rise over run. It's the excess return divided by the standard deviation. Okay, excess return or standard deviation of each particular portfolio. Now these capital allocation lines, okay, these capital allocation lines, got to press the right button here, okay, these capital allocation lines, the slopes of these capital allocation lines have a special name. All right, these slopes essentially are the Sharpe ratio, and the Sharpe ratio has in the numerator excess return, in the denominator total risk, okay, in excess return in the numerator, denominator total risk. All right, and essentially what we're doing is we would like to be able to compare. Okay, we'd like to be able to compare assets. Okay, we'd like to be able to compare assets to the slope of the capital market line. Am I getting more or less return per unit of total risk, okay, than what I can in the marketplace? Okay, than what I can in the marketplace. Now there is a different measure that comes up. Okay, it's a different measure. It's called the M-squared measure. And it stands for the Modigliani and Modigliani measure. Right? And essentially what it takes into account, okay, what it takes into account is the difference, okay, is the difference in return that I get. Okay, is the difference in the return that I get from a potential asset as provided by its capital allocation line relative to the capital market line. And in the simplest terms, you say, so what does this mean? Well, just look at the graph. Look, what is it measuring? It's measuring how much more return I get relative to the capital market line as if I had the same risk as the overall market. So what you think about, and what you should think about is that from this idea here, okay, this idea, or not idea, I guess, this concept of M squared, which adds a little bit more information than just the Sharpe ratio, i.e. adds a little bit more information than just the slope, in that the standpoint is that M squared, it gives us our extra percentage return for a leveraged portfolio that has the same risk as the market portfolio. So if you really want to think about it, if I had the same total risk as the market portfolio, okay, how much more excess return do I get? Okay, how much more return do I get from investing in that asset? And that's what the M squared measure gives us. Okay, that's what the M squared measure gives. Well, when we get back to, all right, so just as an aside now, I was kind of making, how do I say, you have to have building blocks, right? So when we had just the capital allocation, standard deviation space, and I can put the market in terms of standard deviation too, correct? That's just total risk. So these concepts here are relative to total risk, but whenever we are calculating the risk-adjusted returns using specifically just the capital asset pricing model ideas, okay, capital asset pricing models ideas, we have what? Expected return versus beta. okay, expected return versus beta. And the idea, one of the measures that we have, just using beta is the trainer measure. Now look at what the trainer measure says. In the numerator, it's the excess return per what? Unit of systematic risk. Sharp is excess return per unit of standard deviation, or i.e. excess return per unit of total risk. Trainer is excess return per unit of systematic risk. And essentially what we're doing is when we think about this trainer measure, all right, it is the slope of that portfolio that we're investigating. So we have this portfolio P relative to the market, and you say to yourself, well, in equilibrium, this wouldn't happen. That's true, and that's true, but equilibrium is kind of an averaging concept, and sometimes we're out of equilibrium, right? We want to see whether or not things are going to be priced correctly. Whenever they come into play, they weren't taking into account there's some kind of disequilibrium force that threw us out of balance or whatever. That's the idea that's happening here. Okay, and that's the idea that's happening here. So essentially what we're doing when we look at the trainer measure, we're really just evaluating and comparing the slope of two different portfolios relative to the market. Okay, and remember, what is that slope of the market line? That's the security market line. That's beta. That's going to be 1. Okay, so from that idea, that's the concept. An additional factor that comes into play is also a measure called Jensen's alpha. Okay, Jensen's alpha. Jensen's alpha, all right, so I would think, if we go back to the previous slide, here's the analogy. When we talk about Sharp, okay, we talk about what? Measuring slope relative to the capital market line. When we talk about trainer, we're talking about measuring slope of an asset to the security market line. When we talk about M squared, we're talking about the difference, okay, in return relative to that of the market in total risk terms. Whenever we talk about Jensen's alpha, we're talking about this excess return above the equilibrium return of a portfolio that has the same beta. Okay, not the same beta, but essentially the excess return as if it sat on the security market line. So when we think about trainer, and you say to yourself, well, what the heck is trainer? Think about comparing slopes. When we think about alpha, think about comparing distance of return, okay, distance of return off of the security market line. So the analogy that I like to try to indicate to people is that Sharp and trainer give what? Excess return per unit of something. Sharp is total risk. Trainer is systematic risk. M squared gives us what? A measure of return, okay, as if we had the same risk as the market. And Jensen's alpha gives us what? Measure of return as if we had the same systematic risk not the same systematic risk, but if we were generating return off of the security market line. So there's analogy, there's parallel concepts, even though the numbers are different and the structures are different. The numbers are different, the structures are different. There are analogies between these two. And the whole concept of calculating a risk-adjusted return, we could run a whole seminar series by itself, but the idea in the big picture perspective is just think of risk return. We think of risk drives return, no matter which way you talk about, whether it's total risk or systematic risk. Okay, in that we can calculate benefits per cost, i.e. excess return per cost, which would be risk, in either terms of total risk or in terms of systematic risk. So that's kind of like a big encompassing piece to think about, right? Okay, so and you say to yourself, well, man, John, that's just lots of just theoretical concepts out there that really aren't helping me very much. Yeah, they are. And here's a prime example of how to do that. As an analyst, what we can do is we can use these particular tools. Okay, we can use these particular tools, the capital asset pricing model concept is what I mean, to indicate whether or not a stock is overpriced at its equilibrium price. Now I want to do just a little slight review, just to make sure we got an idea, make sure we're in the same ballpark here. Okay, when we're talking about returns now, let me make sure I'm in the right place here. Okay, when we're talking about returns, the easiest way to think about returns, all right, let's just review total return, right? That's just end minus beginning divided by beginning plus a flow component divided by beginning, right? Okay, and this what? This is essentially the change in the value for an asset, and this is just some kind of, and just as broad as it turns out, I'll just call it the income component. Okay, all right. So just total return can be thought of as being broken into these two pieces, right? It can be broken into these two pieces. So just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, because now what I have here is I have three stocks. Well, I have a couple of things. I've got a risk-free rate, I've got an expected return of the market, and then I have three stocks. I have three stocks with each stock has two pieces of information. Well, three pieces of information. Four pieces of information, sorry. I have, I'll break it into three, but it's really four. Okay. I have I have price today. I know what that is. All right. I have an expected price 1 year from now. I have expected dividend that I might get, i.e. income that I'm going to get from each particular stock. And then I also have a beta. Okay, then I also have a beta. So whenever I'm doing this analysis, the idea is that I have a forecast, and then I want to be able to use the framework of the capital asset pricing model. So I have betas. Okay, I have betas for that. So here's the idea. Okay, here's the idea. All right, what I want to be able to do, and what I want to be able to do is to evaluate my forecast of what's going to happen relative to what the capital asset pricing model says for each particular asset. And that's easy to do. So let's go ahead and walk through each. Okay? So for asset A, I have a forecast return. Now, this is nothing other than end minus beginning plus flow divided by beginning of 12%. Okay? And then the required return, which is in the simplest of terms, this is the cap M. Okay? This is the cap M return. All right? I have what? I have the risk-free rate plus the beta times the difference between the market and the risk-free rate of 15%. So I have a difference between my forecast and the required return, or my forecast and what the capital asset pricing model says. For asset B, I generate 17.5% on my forecast, and the capital asset pricing model indicates that only 13.4% is required. And then for asset C, my forecast indicates 16.6%, while the capital asset pricing model also indicates that it's 16.6%. And you're saying to yourself, well, what does all that mean? Okay, what does all that mean? Well, from a graphical perspective, let's just focus on the fundamentals. The security market line is what is generated by what? The capital asset pricing model. Okay, the capital asset pricing model. So we have these set. Okay, we have these set, and asset A, it has the same what? It has the same beta as the market. Okay, it has the same beta as the market. Asset B has a beta that's less than the market, and asset C has a beta that is equal to the market. Okay, our forecast, however, our forecast of asset A. Right, of asset A is less than what the security market line is saying. Okay, so if we go back to the previous slide, and I hate to do that here. Go back to the previous slide. You know what, I'm going to go up one. But anyway, when we do forecasts, our forecast, we can compare it to what the required return of the capital asset pricing model says. All right, and so when we look at the next slide, okay, our forecast return. Okay, our forecast return is less than what is required by the market for asset A. For asset B, it's greater than what's required by the market. But for asset C, it's equal to the market. All right. So when we kind of formulate, in our heads, okay, whether these assets are overpriced, overvalued or undervalued, or equilibrium valued or fairly valued, we can compare our forecast return to that determined by the capital asset pricing model. And what we see, is that since stock A's forecast return, it's not going to generate enough it's not going to generate enough return. So we need to get rid of it or sell it. Asset B, on the other hand, we think it's going to generate 17.5%, while the capital asset pricing model, according to the equation, only indicate that 13.4% is required. So we think it's going to generate more return than what's being required by the market. Therefore, we need to buy it. We believe it's undervalued. And then stock C, okay, is essentially equal to what is required by the marketplace, and that we're relatively indifferent in that the standpoint that we're not going to make too much of. We're going to make too much of a fuss because we are forecasting what the market is believing it will be generating, or the market is required, not relieving, required. Okay, I like to think of it this way: when we do the graphing of these relative to the security market line, when we are above, when we are sitting, our forecasts are sitting above the security market line, it's undervalued, and whenever we're sitting below, it's overvalued. So I like to see it from that perspective. Okay, I like to see it from that perspective because remember, the capitalized pricing model in equilibrium is a required number, and required and expected number are the same. If we're out of equilibrium, we compare those two. Okay, we can compare those two. So from that aspect, that's the idea. Very nice little structure. A very nice little structure there. Right. Now, we're almost done in this section here. Almost done in this section, but I just wanted to just kind of review. Okay, a little bit about the portfolio sections, the portfolio material. When we talk about the capital market line versus the security market line, two things that come up too that I think you should recognize. Capital market line, we've got expected return versus standard deviation. Security market line, we've got expected return versus beta. Okay, so that's an idea to kind of think about. When we talk about the capital market line, we're only really talking about efficient portfolios, i.e. the market that's out there, right? Okay. The capital market line is based on total risk, i.e. its expected return versus standard deviation. Any asset or portfolio, however, when we talk about security market line, any asset or portfolio, whether it's efficient or not, we can plot it relative to the security market line, right? Which essentially brings us into allowing us to evaluate. I guess really from a theoretical perspective and from an implementation perspective, allow us to evaluate a little bit more. Higher number of assets, potential assets, based on the standpoint that we, it doesn't matter whether the asset is efficient or not. We can look at the individual stock versus looking at the portfolio of stock, right? All right, and then the security market line is based on expected return versus standard deviation. Expected return versus beta. So I like to make sure that people who walk through the stuff and the material that I'm discussing, understand fundamentally when we're talking about capital market line, we're talking about total risk. When we're talking about capitalized pricing model, we're talking about beta. We're talking about beta. So from that aspect, I think it's very important for you to be able to see those differences. Okay. Final slide here in the portfolio management material of Port 1 and the risk and return portion of the seminar series. Hey, it's just a basic problem, right? And what I mean by basic problem is just a basic implementation and calculation problem, right? The idea is that this all goes back to the capitalized pricing model. Capitalized pricing model, security market line, same thing. Just think of it that way. So we have expected return of the market, 15%, risk-free asset, 8%. The beta of an individual stock is 1.2, but we forecast the stock to generate a return of 17%. If we have this information, can we formulate whether or not the stock is over or undervalued? Over or undervalued. Well, if we think about it, right now, the answer turns out to be that it's undervalued, but by 0.25 percentage point. But how do we get that, right? How do we get that? Well, from the capitalized pricing model. Okay, the capitalized pricing model. This is the CAPM number, right? This is the risk-free rate. That's its beta. That's the market risk premium. Okay, and then we get what? Required returns. Okay, by 16.75%. Okay. However, our forecast is 17%. So we're sitting above the security market line, right? We're sitting about what? According to the capitalized pricing model, by 16.7 or 25 basis points or 0.25 percentage points. So you can see, that you can use the capitalized pricing model for just a plethora of calculations that generate lots of help in deciding and making decisions about investment portfolios. So that's it about the portfolio risk and return within the portfolio management section in the seminar series. Part one, we just talked about some real structure basics. Part two, we got in a little bit more details about efficiency, overall, how do we formulate portfolios, the difference between capital market line and security market line. And so from that aspect, that's how you should, I would be, if I'm looking at this material, that's how I would be incorporating it into my head. Seeing the main differences, kind of separating basics from a little bit more advanced and intermediate type of ideas. And that's what, that's what we are attempting to do with separating the portfolio management risk and return sections into these two parts.